got so quiet. Thank you for following instructions. Well, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. My name is Michael Norris. I'm the Executive Director of the Carpenters Company. We're happy to co-host this conversation with our friends at ULI Philly and the Design Advocacy Group. So thank you to them for partnering with us. A couple of things, if you're not familiar with the Carpenters Company, we were founded in 1724, so we're a really old organization. It was originally a guild of master builders who in the 18th century designed and constructed a large portion of our great city. In the early 1770s, the company built Carpenter's Hall, which is our National Historic Landmark site in Old City, and we have owned and operated that building ever since then. In 1774, the hall hosted the First Continental Congress, so we have a wonderful connection to the origins of our American democracy. And we continue today as a professional association of architects, builders, and engineers. Many of our members are in this room tonight, so thank you for being here and for continuing the centuries of impact we've had on Philadelphia. A couple of people to thank. Our sponsor for tonight's program is Langen Engineering, Benton Crease and others. This program tonight is part of a larger series we've been doing all year called Changing the Face of the City, which has been an exploration of various aspects of historic preservation and urban planning, seen through a lens of social justice and equity. So that program overall has included a really fascinating walking tour that we did in September of Society Hill and Independence National Historical Park, looking at some of what worked there and didn't work so well there in terms of preservation and urban planning. And we had a really wonderful speaker series looking at some case studies around the country around these issues. So this event tonight is the culmination of that whole program, and our sponsor for the whole Changing the Face of the City series has been Premier Building Restoration, so I want to acknowledge them and also thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, which also gave us some support for this. So you might be wondering why we're not actually having this event at Carpenter's Hall, and that is because Carpenter's Hall is closed and has been closed since late April for about a $3 million preservation project, which is actually winding down. We'll be reopening the hall early in the new year, and we'll look forward to having events like this on site there once we are reopened. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. We are filming this tonight. It's not being live streamed or zoomed, but we are capturing it on video, just so you all know. And then after the discussion, obviously we'll continue to eat and drink and continue the dialogue. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce someone who needs no introduction in this audience for sure, but our moderator for this evening is Carpenter's Company member Alan Greenberger.
Good evening, everybody. This is nice. This is like, how's that? It's nice to see everybody. This is like old homework here. What Michael didn't tell you about the Carpenters Company was that there was a thing called the ticket prices, which is when we were allowed to collude on prices of design services and trade services. That was kind of fun. But obviously hasn't been much of anything for a while. So I'm going to ask each. What's that?
Who's that?
Well, the Department of Justice, and so we, try to live by the law most times. I'm just going to go down the line and ask everybody to just introduce themselves quickly. Like, what do you do? Who are you? What do you do? And then we'll go into some questions.
Hi everyone. Good afternoon. No, evening. Eleanor Sharpe. I'm the deputy in the Department of Planning and Development, and I'm also simultaneously the executive director of the City Planning Commission. I oversee the Division of Planning and Zoning, which has the Historical Commission, the Art Commission, the Zoning Board, and the Planning Commission. And a lot of my staff is here today, so yay.
Good evening, my name is Leslie Smallwood-Lewis. I'm one of the co-founders and COO of Mosaic Development Partners. We are a real estate development firm based right in Strawberry Mansion, and we've been at this since about 2008, and we'll get a little bit more into, what our company's ethos is all about.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Matt Ruben, and I am quite notably less qualified to be here than our other two guests. I live in Northern Liberties, and I am the chair of the Central Delaware Advocacy Group, which is the civic coalition charged with the stewarding of the Central Delaware Master Plan and Zoning Overlay. And I'm on the board of the Northern Liberties Neighbors Association, where I served as president for about 16 years and have been involved with a lot of this stuff. Thanks.
So we have a lead-off question that I'm going to ask each of our panelists to answer, and then I have teed up some questions for each of them individually, and then we'll see where this goes. And if you all have questions, you should just raise your hand. We don't need to wait to some logical ending. Just sort of raise your hand, and we'll take it as it comes. So the lead-off question is this. I mean, this is a really great group because Eleanor's from government, Leslie's from development, and Matt's from being a gadfly and community leader and community leader. But it's a nice perspective. And so the leadoff question is this, and it relates to something that Michael referenced before, and is somewhat the origin, I guess, of this series, which is about historic preservation. And it goes like this. There's a lot of pressure, we all know, in fact many of you have been involved in this, a lot of pressure to further landmark more buildings and historic districts. In fact, there was a new one just created a couple of weeks ago in Paladin Village. That you can applaud. That even includes a couple of Drexel buildings. That is supposed to stop. It's fine. But the real question is that occasionally, and you all know this, occasionally there's tensions between growth, development, and historic preservation. So the question I have for the panel is, what's been your experience with the intersection between preservation and development? And I think most of us would say that, the obvious answer is, well, they're all compatible. But my question to the group is, first, are they compatible? I'm assuming the answer is going to be sort of yes. But the question is, how do you manage the compatibility? Because there are occasionally tensions. So, Eleanor, if I could ask you to get going on that?
Sure. So, before I give you a very definitive answer, I'd like to share with the audience the context in which we work at the city and government when we're thinking of development and when we're thinking of preservation. And the context is such that as we're resource constrained, and when you work in a resource constrained environment, one has to learn how to prioritize. And what gets prioritized doesn't always align necessarily with one's values, but with what one has to do. And the context within which we work is, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, you may have noticed development is off the charts. And what has ended up happening is that my division, which includes the Historical Commission, but also planning and the zoning board, has been stretched thin to keep up with our regulatory responsibilities, which translated to plain English means that whatever we need to do in the development pipeline to ensure that projects that are coming through move through and are not obstructed because of our lack of doing what we're responsible for from a charter mandated position has been all-consuming. I'll give you a better example. The Historical Commission has to review permits. On average per year, they review about 2,400 to 2,600 permits. They have a staff of about 6 to 7, probably 5 or 6. So on average, we work 200 days of the year so that each person is probably reviewing, 6 into 24, 400 permits per year. And that's just the regulatory work. Same goes for a zoning board. Our staff, which is also small there, has to review about 1,600 cases related to variances and special exceptions Planning Commission, similar. Plan reviews, we go through thousands in the permitting stage. So oftentimes there's lots of demand from the community about what we should be doing versus what we have to be doing. And we're consumed with work, especially in the last 2 years, that is beyond anybody's reasonable imagination. And so where preservation intersects with development is where we have to do a host of transactional work because we just have to get it done. That doesn't take away from our desire of our value to preserve or to plan or to advocate for appropriate zoning in areas. So I have staff capacity that, and I say kudos to them, I have the best staff because they work so hard for the people of Philadelphia just to get stuff done. The Planning Commission staff is, I'll give you an example. LA has a staff of about 400 planners. New York has a staff of about 300. Phoenix, which is the 5th largest city in the country, we are the 6th at $1.6 million. Phoenix has about 500 planners. I'm curious, how many planners do you guys think we have at the city of Philadelphia? Throw out some.
20.
Great! That's my thing. We have 27 planners that are serving the city of Philadelphia. We have 6 historic preservation planners. We have about 9 people at the zoning board. I think my total staff in the division, I'm not even sure if we've hit 50. So when we get a lot of demand and a lot of anxiety from folks who are saying, what are you doing? I'm here to tell you, we're doing a heck of a lot. The Historical Commission has designated more in the Kennedy administration than they ever had since 1985. Compared to their peer cities, each historic preservation planner has done more work compared to the other cities. So I just want to lay the context of where and how preservation does happen and doesn't happen, and for you to be considerate about my lovely staff and advocate for us, since this is an advocacy group, to increase our capacity, which will only serve the city much better. That's my 2 cents.
So I guess I should stop calling John Monlack all the time.
I'm the person bugging the 27 people that work.
Oh my gosh. You put it in perspective. Thank you. I'm gonna ease up on you guys quite a bit. Well, I have actually been involved in the intersection of preservation and development quite a bit. And, you know, the objective would be obviously to preserve if possible. But I will say, as a developer, we take a pretty much pragmatic approach to preservation. Let me give you a couple of examples. We have a project at 30th and Cecil B. Moore called Eastern Lofts. And it actually won a Preservation Alliance award, right? So we were on the right side of preservation for that particular project. But it was an interesting journey because we took it to the SHPO and we were denied in a week. They were like, you're crazy, you're not putting a roof on the building, what are you thinking? No, denied. So we're like, this isn't gonna work any other way. So you have to also consider the feasibility of a project. If we had put the roof back on that building, we would have only gotten 13 oversized apartments in a neighborhood that would never demand the rent. The rent would have been like $1 a square foot because you just weren't getting it. By not putting the roof back on that building, we were able to increase the yield of the apartments to 37 because what we actually did was create an interior courtyard which allowed us to have legal windows to be able to stack apartments and create more density. So we went to DC, we appealed it, we went before the chief appeals officer, and he actually ruled in our favor. And he had made some suggestions to add kind of a pergola kind of roof to mimic additional roof coverage to get us to about 75% coverage from their perspective, which ended up being a fantastic add to the design because it added shadows and you know, just a nice different effect and brought the design kind of into a very intimate space. But if we had not gone that extra step and appealed, that would have been a building that would have been sitting blighted, causing havoc in a community. There were dog fights, we must have had 40 dump trucks come and take debris and trash out of that building. So when you evaluate preservation, you do have to take into account the impact that it's having on that neighborhood. Another example, Edison High School, sitting at 7th and Lehigh, a 400,000 square foot old school sitting for 12 years, desolate, vacant, and just, again, drug activity. Ended up having a fire because squatters were in there burning, trying to stay warm, and it was a 4-alarm fire. After we purchased it, by the way, I could see the fire from Broad and Olney. And I was like, I wonder what that is burning. I get a call, it's your building. I'm like, oh gosh. But that was on the registry because a lot of school buildings are on the registry. We decommissioned that building. We had to take it off because there is no use that any of us in this room could come up with that would occupy 400,000 square feet at 7th and Lehigh. It's not happening. If it's not an institutional user that just wants to come in and do a good deed, it has to be a city building, a government building, they weren't coming. So do you prefer to have a blighted building, bringing down value, creating more crime, perpetuating blight, sitting in this community? No. So yes, we decommissioned that building. And with that, we tore it down. We saved, we did a landmark because it was actually the one school that had the most deaths in the Vietnam War. So there is a historic landmark there. There was cornerstones that we maintained, and we worked with the alumni from the school to make sure they were salvaged during demo. And now there's a vibrant community shopping center where people can walk to get fresh food. It was a food desert. It's employing people that live in the community. And we maintain the annex building of that particular structure. And we have 66 veterans, homeless veterans, that now live in that building and that work in that community shopping center. So you have to be able to weigh the pros and cons of preservation. So we're in this space all the time. We're building a new, we were just selected through an RFP process to build a new school in Port Richmond. That school is on the registry. Do you want the kids to still be in an obsolete school? Doesn't have air, it's not really the new 21st century kind of learning environment. We're about to decommission another school building so that these kids can get a brand new school building. Is it my goal to do that? Absolutely not, but in the communities that I work in primarily, I have to make those decisions every day. And we're hoping that the city, which normally sees that these are hard decisions, but they're decisions that have to be made to really improve circumstances in these communities. So that's been my experience.
Thank you. I should also mention that Leslie, her partner and ensemble, who are partnered together at the Navy Yard, I want to just mention the hotel project.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a really good example. So down at the Navy Yard, if you all are not familiar, there's quite a few historic buildings, and they all have their numbers, and which really kind of tell you what building they were in succession of being constructed. But one in particular that we're working on right now is the old barracks building. So when the people came back from being deployed, they would stay there at the barracks, they would get checked out health-wise, that's where they would, stay until they were redeployed out. Very large structure that we are gonna be converting into a 4.5-star hotel spa with just a beautiful curated courtyard, challenging building. Roof, the roof is not on the 3rd level, it's not as gracious as you would want it to be. And I will say this, it's a historic building that we are not taking historic tax credits on, which is a shame, because that would help us with the expensive cost of construction. But when we took it to SHPO, they were like, you want to change the windows. And what we literally wanted to do, the top floor of windows were not didn't have as much length to them. We wanted to mirror the ones that were on the 2nd floor. And it absolutely looked beautiful. It didn't look out of place. It looked very, just, what's the word I want to say? Very natural. Thank you. Exactly. They said, hell no. That's what they said. They didn't say those words, but that's how I heard it. That's how I received it. But so we literally had to not pursue historic tax credits because we needed the windows to be larger for the hotel to be successful going forward. So it's a shame, that we are definitely restoring this building and it's going to be beautiful, but that we had to forego millions of dollars of equity that we would have definitely appreciated being part of the capital stack, because they're very rigid sometimes.
On the PIDC review committee, and it's a wonderful project. It's really, I think it's going to be just a terrific project. And I'm sorry that you didn't get the tax credits, but having dealt with the same group on something else, it's tough.
It's tough.
It's tough. Matt?
I guess my answer would be, are development and historic preservation compatible? They can be in the right circumstances, but if I have to choose one or the other of a yes or no, my answer is no. And the reason, I think, has been aptly illustrated, which is that development is about looking at the physical state and the potential uses and the economics of the present and the future. And historic preservation is about preserving primarily structures, but deep symbolic memories associated with those structures from the past. And the idea of historic preservation at its core, at least when you talk to community people, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this narrative, and many of us have thought and said it ourselves. All of this development is coming to X area, which might be my neighborhood, and nothing is getting preserved. If all of this new profit is going to be realized by people coming in and investing in the neighborhood, why can't they preserve some of the stuff that we care about? I mean, this is a sort of on-the-street, common sense observation. It's not where the conversation ends, but it's where it starts. And so at that level, preservation has nothing to do with the economic viability of redevelopment and preserving a structure. Nothing whatsoever. And development, as Leslie, you quite illustrated so well, has everything to do with that. And so they're fundamentally different interests. And they're not directly opposed, but they're at best at right angles to each other. And so there's a huge challenge. And without incentives, government-sponsored incentives to steer the market forces, you're going to have a minimum of preservation rather than a maximum of preservation. To your point, Eleanor, I would say absolutely 1,000%, and I think that the onus is on the citizenry to nominate structures for protection. And I've always found the Historical Commission's staff to be incredibly hardworking, and have also made a lot of great staff recommendations. Where my experience is run on the rocks, and I'm speaking in particular, well, I'm speaking about a couple of things, but the one that sticks most in my mind is some folks might be aware that on the unit block of Fairmount Avenue in Northern Liberties, where I am, there is a row of about 4 or 5 heavily modified row house structures that date from colonial times. And it's the only intact colonial row in Northern Liberties, and I think it's the only intact colonial row in the river wards, except for, if you count Alfred Sally there, but it's very unusual. And we did get it designated, but it was a hellacious battle to get it designated, because the owner of the property, and you might remember this, Alan, the owner was a company that owns and builds car dealerships. And they were erroneously told that the current waterfront zoning overlay would allow them to build a car dealership. And Alan was head of the planning commission, chair of the planning commission at the time, and I remember the email where you were like, no, you're not. And so it sat there for sale, and presumably because they wanted to clear the site and did not want it encumbered, they opposed a nomination for historic preservation. It was, I don't even want to go on with all details, but it wound up going to Commonwealth Court. It just kept getting appealed, and it was a hellacious fight. And what I learned from that, or what I took away from that, was that the staff recommended it, and I believe the relevant committee recommended it. But the several members of the board of the commission were at least initially persuaded by an expert testimony that basically said you shouldn't designate this because it's been modified. It's not a nice example. It's been changed too much. And my feeling was, where in an industrial city like Philadelphia, outside of maybe Old City and parts of Center City, are you going to find 300-year-old rows of row houses that have not been modified? The context has changed. Well, no kidding, they put I-95 in 50 years ago right here. I mean, so I think the vision and the definition of what is worth being preserved and what does it mean to preserve history in an industrial city outside the well-known centers of colonial history downtown, I think that's a question that we can discuss and that we should discuss, and maybe we should look at our criteria and with the utmost respect, look at the commission itself and who's on it and what mindsets they're bringing to their decisions. Because in my view, that doesn't cost any money to have that conversation. It doesn't require more staff to have that conversation. And I think it's a useful one for us to have because more and more neighborhoods are becoming subjects of development. Like, for example, Strawberry Mansion in Mantua, they're right on it. Francisville has been going through it for the last 10 or 15 years. This is going to happen over and over and over again. And the idea that certain things are not worth preserving when their historical significance to the community is off the chart is something I think we need to look into. So that's been my experience.
Well, thank you all for that. Now, I'm gonna change topics for each one of them, but before I do, just do want to open it up for any questions because this is a big one.
I want to ask a question because having been involved in the design review with Eleanor and Alan on this early on, are we going to expo? I think we're looking good at that time. I think that the question is whether there was an effort or could be an effort now to save those credits, given the fact that politically we've got, 9 people running for mayor next year who have an interest in preservation. We've got a new governor who needs to know that the SPO is somebody who has been troubled in terms of projects like this, because this is a big enough project and a key to a whole new approach on the Navy Yard, and whether that's going to be tried, where you put PIDC, the Commerce Department, the developer, the Planning Commission together in a way to try and still get that, because I think as Alan said, it's a superb design, and it would be a shame not to have you get that to make the project as good as it can be.
That's actually a really good point, and to be completely honest, had not thought about it. And what's interesting is, we have slowed down just a bit, as we all know, with, just the volatility in the market and interest rates and cost of construction just being so high right now, that it might give us that window to really reconsider and really take a hard look at that. Because for the same reasons, with all the additional costs, be able to incorporate the tax credits would relieve some of that burden to the project. So it's actually a very good thought. I will definitely bring that back to the team.
And this is a question for Eleanor, touching on the mayoral candidates as well. Which of them have actually advocated for increased staff to your themselves?
None. But to be fair, I'm not sure that they understand the context of what we're doing or that, and their advocacy, it's not the city council, it's the administrative side, so yeah. And I'll say this issue of scarce resource is not limited just to my division. Like, Elle and I would consider our cousins, they similarly swamped and lack capacity. Philadelphia approved more residential units through permitting last year than New York City did. Those LMI examiners were working till midnight and beyond, perhaps because of the tax abatement, but nevertheless. So this is something that plagues the city overall, and the challenge is funding something when there's so much crisis in the city that it's hard for a mayor to stand up and say, oh, I'm gonna fund these planners, you know, because, and what do planners exactly do that's tangible that somebody can like hold on to versus gun violence or opioids or real, not to underline them, real social issues that we have as a city that government is in the position and the only ones to do something about. It's really a hard sell in the seat I sit to say to the administration, give me more money when there are like real needs that need to be balanced and has to do with prioritization again at the end of the day. So it's a very hard place. I personally believe if you don't plan for it, then these issues will forever will be in a reactionary mode. So if you don't invest now in setting policy and setting it up and being strategic about it and investing in people who can bring that to the table, not necessarily like immediate to address the problem, then this problem will persist for the length of time and we'll always be in this crazy cycle of sort of reacting. So. And Alan knows more about
Okay, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna take the two questions I see back there, and then I'm gonna move on to other topics. Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned at the end Mantua and Strawberry Mansion. I don't live in either of those neighborhoods, I'm familiar with them. Strawberry Mansion, I'm particularly thinking about, I worked as a historic house guide in Fairmount Park, so I rode the 7 bus, the 48, and I could see changes. And I listened to the people around me. And so you get these neighborhoods where historic preservation, maybe they're not historic in the traditional sense of colonial whatever, but these have been intact neighborhoods for a long time. And now you have the developers moving in and taking over, like we've got the brownstones on this street and whatever. So I'm really concerned about the people in those neighborhoods. Where are they going to go? And a different kind of historic preservation that we may have to rethink this.
So the historic preservation is actually thinking about this, like outside of doing their permitting work. And there's a survey, a cultural survey that they're trying to design right now, because preservation historically has been from a white gaze, and preservation has been about buildings or structures. And how do we define historic preservation for our city that involves a host of minority, a host of culture, a host of different things to preserve, food, culture, you name it, and it's not just the building. So I would say that it's very much front and center of our work, and how do we sort of revisit how we think about and execute preservation and what it means to everyone, and not just the typical colonial white gaze.
And in addition to that, just real quickly, I'm sorry, in neighborhoods, and Strawberry Mansion is a great example, the CDC actually advocated for a zoning overlay as well in that neighborhood to maybe not preserve all of the historic structures, but to respect them. So if you're coming in and building something new in that neighborhood, that there's a certain height restriction, there's certain facade materials that you have to use. They're requiring that they have front porches so that there's a continuity on certain blocks, right? So the way that they created the overlay, any developer coming in still needs to come to them and be able to vet their design and make sure that they really are adopting these design standards and guidelines that were put into this overlay. One of our projects was actually one of the first ones that needed to be approved once the overlay was passed. And we definitely had a different design. And she probably, because we had been communicating with the executive director for a long time, she might have approved it, but we said, you know what? This is just passed. We don't want you to go out the gate not having this overlay being respected. And we went back to the drawing board and we redesigned it. And we incorporated all the guidelines and standards into our project because it was on a prominent block. It was on 33rd Street. So this is going to be something that's going to be very visible, and we wanted to respect, you know, what they were trying to get accomplished in that community. So there are ways, you know, to really advocate, you know, to have certain controls. You can't control everything, but you can definitely try to create some guidelines.
I just wanted to add briefly that one of the ways that inequality gets perpetuated is under the cover of the claim that it doesn't exist. And while there are many parts of Philadelphia that are decayed because of deindustrialization and historic population loss until it got turned around 15 years ago, the fact remains that there is a strong correlation between race and poverty in America for a reason, which is a long history of institutionalized racism. And so to me, it's kind of like a perpetuation of the historic inequalities to kind of say, well, these structures can't be saved because they're too run down to communities that have been systematically deprived of resources for over 100 years. So I applaud that thinking that the commission is doing, because I think as neighborhoods that have been historically predominantly of color become subject to more development pressures, this issue is going to come to a head, and already is. And I think it's a different thing to look at an industrial structure within a neighborhood that might have a fair amount of infrastructural resources versus an intact neighborhood, like you said, that has had historic disinvestment, and then to just say, well, too bad, we're sorry that your structures were subject to that disinvestment, but we're not going to preserve them because they're beyond saving. There's got to be another way to approach that.
If I could add one thing, I know I'm supposed to be the moderator, but I can't help it. It's possible, and I'm not saying this actually from a point of view yet, but it's possible that preservation law may be or may not be the right tool to answer some of this. You really have to look at what the law allows and what it doesn't allow, and you probably need more tools than just that. You know, historic preservation can freeze an historic property. For whatever reason it's deemed historic, it can freeze it in place, but you can't force it to be redeveloped or fixed yet. So this is a problem. I mean, I'm worried about it constantly with the Church of the Assumption on Spring Garden Street, which I guess is still there and is still undone, right? I was terrified that that steeple was going to fall over one day. Well, the Historic Commission could freeze that in place and say, no, you can't do anything with it. But it can't make the steeple get fixed. So there's all kinds of other stuff behind preservation law. You had a question back here? What was it?
Yeah, I hear you all speak. We're talking about like land use planning and development, whether it's going to be pursued or developing the new things that we can have. And I guess I was curious about the aspect of it. Every time you hear about any kind of development, the first complaint is like traffic, whether that's vehicle traffic or foot traffic. So I was wondering if any of you specifically or all of you have perspectives on, if you're developing a piece of land, how you preserve or don't preserve or try to improve the travel right away for pedestrian vehicles and things in the middle, besides just the building itself. So I'd be curious what you think about that.
So there is an Office of Complete Streets at the City of Philadelphia that is in our OTIS, Office of Transportation and Infrastructure. We also have staff on board, in my 27 staff. There are 2 or 3 staff, especially for our civic design review projects, that we also do a complete streets analysis, which looks at all modal activities in and around the proposed development. And we give this feedback to the developers to consider in terms of their development proposal. So yes, we do take into consideration, the thing about planning, it's comprehensive. We consider everything.
Most of our developments, we will actually bring on a traffic planner to be able to actually study, how are people moving, walking, cars, does there need to be traffic signals added? Do there need to be calming measures on certain streets? Do they need to be established crosswalks to be able to provide safe travel for pedestrians from the project across to maybe a parking lot or where the bus stop is? So we usually have a traffic planner in most of our larger developers to assess that. We don't want to make assumptions. And they really are boots on the ground. They are out there studying, watching how people move, how many cars are going per hour on that particular street. Where are people going to park? How are they going in and out of parking lots? So it's a very critical component of most of our projects to know that component.
I would only add that I think that, at least in my experience, when I moved into Northern Liberties, it had about 3,500 people. Now it has about 10,000, and by the end of the decade, it may have 20,000. There's 5,200 units permitted, and more than half are under construction. Every time we think it's done, it goes to the next level. And I say this because I'm sort of a convert, which is in terms of something that neighbors often bring up is it will, like traffic volume, it will create more or too much vehicular traffic. And I have not seen that be the case. Whether you're talking about a casino or whether you're talking about 20 years of quadrupling and quintupling neighborhood population, I don't think traffic volume is a huge issue. And it might not be until the city starts to get closer to that 2.5 million population that it was planned for back in the Ed Bacon days. I think what you said, Leslie, and what you talked about, Eleanor, is at the micro level about safety and visibility and pedestrian crossing and getting protected bike lanes and councilman prerogative out of the frickin' bike lane conversation. And that it's important at that level, for sure. And I also have noticed that more development and more investment and more density brings more stakeholders and more attention from Otis because it becomes obvious to them that something needs to be done. And I've seen in my own neighborhood the safety consequences of, for example, one-way stop intersections that might have made sense when there was nobody, the neighborhood was 80% depopulated from its 20th century peak, and now is a death trap. But it also, requires things like parking enforcement from the parking authority, because people will put their cars wherever they can, and that destroys visibility and that destroys safety. So micro level, yes. Macro level, I don't really think it's a problem.
So normally I was going to jump around and sort of give you a break since you were the last one to speak that, but you've given this perfect little segue to something I wanted to ask you. I didn't expect it to work, but it works. So, I've known Matt for a long time, and one of the things I've always liked about Matt is that, one, he speaks his mind, including when he was critical of things we were doing, but also that you have a pretty decent ability, I thought, to think about what's happening in the moment and what's happening in the future. And I would not say that of every community group I've ever worked with. So my question to you is, what is the appropriate role for community engagement in decision-making about development? And specifically the question about the future. One of my core beliefs is that particularly planners are in the business of worrying about the people who can never be at the table, which is the future. Right? They can't be there. We're talking about generations. We're talking about 25 and 50, even 100 years. Obviously, none of us are brilliant enough to know what exactly that means, but somebody's got to be worried about it. And how do community groups deal with that? How do they deal with the future? And is it reasonable, and maybe it's just inevitable, that votes taken about projects right now, which may be voted on by the interested and the willing, wind up being community engagement? I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well,
That's a lot of questions. You can answer whichever one.
well, I'm sure the solution is obvious and easy.
Yeah, right.
In all seriousness, though, I would say a couple of things. One is that I think it's important to keep perspective. Philadelphia citizens and community associations have a lot of opportunities to weigh in on development in the city. They have very few binding opportunities. They don't have nearly as much power as people give them credit for, or as any developer who's ever walked out of an unpleasant community zoning meeting has blamed them for. So zoning variances are a great example. Oh my God, you didn't get the outcome you want? The process is terrible. It wasn't because my project sucked. So it's the process. But then you got the outcome. Great process, great meeting. So the statistics I have in my head may be pre-pandemic, but I doubt they've changed. The ZBA approves something like 88 to 94% of variance cases that come before it. Now, I always do tell my community group colleagues who complain about this that if you take away like the roof deck and the little stuff, it's probably more like 60% of the truly controversial stuff. But still, your chances are pretty good when you go to the ZBA. Civic design review is non-binding for community groups, not to mention the Planning Commission. Special exception, the burden is on the opposition to demonstrate that this would have a particularly negative impact in excess of the normal impact of this kind of use. And historic preservation communities had no binding authority whatsoever. So we can shoot our mouths off a lot, but we don't have a lot of binding authority. Where our authority comes is when it gets filtered through elected officials and the zoning code. So the problem before 2012, in my opinion, was not that communities had too much voice. It was that 2/3 of development projects had to go through the Zoning Board of Adjustment because the zoning code hadn't been rewritten since 1960. Now, more cases have to go to the ZBA than everyone hoped and envisioned back during when you were in the Zoning Code Commission, but it's still a lot less than it used to be. If people are upset about, district council people, screwing up the entire zoning code because they're against density in Northeast Philly, like that's not a community problem, that's a city council leadership problem, in my opinion. So, first of all, we should not overstate the problem of sort of parochial, living in the present, short-sighted residents. But with that said, I think one thing that I've learned from my experience with zoning in Northern Liberties and having the privilege of interacting with dozens of other community groups around the city through various coalitions is that the zoning process in Northern Liberties is a little bit different. We have an RCO, we have a community zoning process, neighbors come, but we do not have a direct democracy model. We do not take votes of those present at our zoning committee meetings. We have a zoning committee that listens to the neighbors, and as our zoning chair always says, the near neighbors get a special voice, but they don't get an absolute veto. And the zoning committee, after discussion with the applicant and Q&A with the neighbors, and then the applicant's asked to leave and the neighbors have their discussion without the applicant there, the committee makes the motion. The committee votes on the motion goes to the organization's board of directors, which ratifies, modifies, or rejects the motion, and almost always ratifies, occasionally modifies it slightly. What does this do? It filters the knee-jerk responses that you get from neighbors, the knee-jerk, but I caution to say, rooted in real lived experience reactions. It filters them through the institutional memory and the understanding that the zoning committee members have through years of experience with lots of different proposals, because a lot of neighbors are going to come out for something close to them. The zoning committee has seen it all. So it provides a kind of perspective that is very much compatible with thinking about the future, because it's not as local to where I live, it's the whole neighborhood. It also is amenable to thinking about the future. And it also enables the organization, honestly, to be more effective. There was another one of our good friend organizations, I'm not going to say which, that was really frustrated because they kept going to the ZBA and they kept losing. And the reason they kept losing is they would go to the ZBA with a letter that said, here's the meeting we had, here's the neighbors attended, here's what they voted. Our zoning process is, okay, we know you're upset about parking, but they're meeting the city parking requirement. We cannot go down to the ZBA and object based on parking. We can object based on other things, and here strategically are the things we could potentially object on if we had issues with this project. And so you're much more likely to win if you have a filtering, facilitating body of knowledgeable people who are able to take in the concerns and give them a certain context and a certain strategic orientation. And so it may sound weird, but I think a representative republic is a much better model for community zoning and RCOs than direct democracy. And I have been a fan of the Planning Commission ever since Michael Nutter came into office and put it on the path it's on today, and so appreciate your work and have publicly defended the Planning Commission. And one little thing I will say is that the RCO, it's a little thing. The RCO regulations encourage inexperienced RCOs or RCOs who take the letter of the regulations to do the model where you have a meeting, you have people vote, and you just report what happened. And I think that's not the best model for the city. And I think the regulations shouldn't be radically changed, but they could potentially be a little tweaked to communicate to RCOs that you can use your discretion and your skills, and the whole point of having a community association to help make the process better. And I hope that what didn't sound like a criticism, because it's not. It's just a small...
Oh, it was, but that's right. No, but I have to say that there's a level of privilege when you live in a community that has people who can do that. And not every community across the city has people with degrees in architecture and planning and law to be able to cultivate that level of discourse and represent it well to the DBA. A lot of times it's just neighbors who they feel like their community is under siege and they're just grasping and they have no idea about rules of meetings and stuff, and they just want somebody to listen to them. So at the Planning Commission, we have registered almost 300 RCOs, and they run the gamut from like grandmothers sitting in a living room to highly functioning Northern Liberties, and we don't discriminate because everybody's voice is just as important because they just want to be heard. So we're cognizant of that, and we take that under advisement.
There's a question over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is a follow-up question from that, and that's a little bit of elaborate, if I can get elaboration on RCO. So this is fairly award year and what's starting, but I unfortunately drawn in involuntarily to some of the RCOs in West Philly, and that what you described is a very functioning RCO. A lot of them are not functioning very well, and some of the functioning is, almost on the legal side. So could I get everybody's voice of how you would maybe adjust the rules of RCOs to try to solve both the problem of having non-professional, a little bit more guidance maybe on that side, but also restrict some of the underhanded deals that go on to get approval from an RCO to develop that. So I guess I'm just asking maybe recommend how you could adjust the rules of the RCO.
Eleanor just said to me, she just reminded me that RCOs were my fault. Which was true. And I have thought 100 times about it because the intentions were right and the outcomes I don't think are right yet. The intentions were, this comment about some neighborhoods are very well organized and have extremely well organized. By the way, that was a spectacular answer and I think really smart. And this whole business of, it's not about a vote taken by the 5 people who are in the room. It's really important. But the intention was always to give neighborhoods that don't have that level of organizational sophistication to encourage them to have it. That was the idea. And if you look at the rules carefully, which when it all started, apparently nobody did, there was no real power accorded to RCOs. It was a convening operation to force a conversation. It still is, as Eleanor said. But people saw it as a kind of, all right, they're putting potential power out there, I better get my chunk of it. And so RCOs that were, 3 people who lived next door to each other, ward leaders, all kinds of interesting political types, as well as previously organized civic associations, sort of jumped into the fray. We were very reluctant to say no. And I think, I don't know what the specific rules should be at this point, and I've sort of stopped thinking about it, to be honest. But there does need to be, and I think, Eleanor, you can confirm this, I think there have been some new regulations that are put into place to start to drive the formation of RCO to what it was supposed to be, which is a mechanism for, an organized mechanism for a voice in commenting on development. and an ability to say, well, we think this, we don't think that, as well as an obligation to developers to face the conversation, that's one, and an obligation to communities to do it in a reasonably timely way, so that we're not jamming people up on one end, and at the other end, developers need to hear what people have to say. I don't know if that's really an answer, because honestly, I've not been in the business of having to think that through. And it's a pretty meaty discussion, and I'm going to suggest, in the interest of time and some other subjects, that we can either talk about it later, or it's a follow-up conversation, and maybe something that we want to get into.
I just have one really quick thing.
Yeah.
The Planning Commission has a Citizens Planning Institute, which is an incredible resource. And I'm thinking, you know, if our CO's leadership had to have one person who went through that, but of course, you need resources and staff for that. And as we established.
Donna, what do you want to say? Because you're like jumping out of your chair. This is Donna Carney, who has made.
Planning Institute since 2010.
Thank you.
We do the 2035 plan. And the whole zoning code discussion around RCOs, which started in 2012, as you know, Matt. We've been struggling with this council's wanting to get involved at every step and keeps changing regulations over the way. I just wanted to make a plug for some videos that we did over the, when COVID hit, because we were trying to reach more people about what RCOs are. There's a bit.ly site about DPD. We'll get it out to you, but there are 8 to 10-minute videos on what are RCOs and what are the procedures around RCOs. We do training yearly for RCOs to try to build their capacity. And I just wanted to say that we do not require in our regulations that they hold a vote. We hold you guys up as a best practice in how you do it. Committee, but there's nothing in our regulations that mandates that people hold a vote. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you.
I want to, if I can, again, we've got another 20 minutes left. Is that right, Michael? 20? Yeah. I want to get Leslie's voice back in this. I have a question that's going to change topics here. Leslie, you and your partner, Greg Reeves, you've been explicitly talking about equitable development. And so what I'd like you to do, if you can, is just help us, first of all, help us understand what is equitable development, and is it done, how does it mix in with for-profit development and the demands of the economy, which you deal with all the time? And I don't know whether you'd like this question or not. If you're doing this right, and I think you are, what will it take other developers to do? And your answer could be, I don't want them to do it. I'm just going to ask you to do it. That's okay too. That
wouldn't be the answer. There's a lot of work to be done, so we can definitely share the space. Equitable development. It's about the intersection of culture, racial demographics, gender demographics, and really bringing a different perspective and voice into development. If you guys just look to your left and look to your right, right? This room itself is very representative of what is the issue in the real estate industry. There's very few people that look like my partner and I. And we said that to ourselves in 2008 when we started the company. And there's been improvement, but it hasn't been significant improvement. Most of you have probably heard our name at panels or in the paper and BizNow a lot over the last year, because we were well poised to feel the impact after George Floyd. There were not a lot of companies in the same situation as ours, and that's why you've heard our name as much as you have. Is that a problem? Yes. Should there be other names heard? Yes. But that has not been the focus of this industry. It has been very systemic. It's been very old boy network. It's been very not inclusive. And why? Because it's a very capital intensive industry. And all of you know, when you look at the statistics, the wealth gap is just astounding. So that doesn't provide or allow for a lot of diversity in this space. So we're here to disrupt it. That's our goal. That's our assignment. Disrupt the industry. And it's not just for my partner and I to be able to gain wealth. Our whole premise is to make others rise with us. So yes, we are growing our company, but we are still very much reliant on third-party companies to help us get our projects completed. And when we do that, we are always looking first for diverse companies to support us in those efforts. We can't always do that, but that is our first objective. When we respond to RFPs, and you know, it's so funny, we use a graphic consultant who's just fantastic, and we do, our team is like the second slide. And our goal is to have as many dots next to our consultants that are reflective of an MBE, a WBE, a small business. So the more dots we have on that page, we know that we're doing our job right. So for us, that's what's representative of equitable development, to encourage, to embrace, to bring in as many diverse providers and other developers into this space so that we can start to change the paradigm. Wealth has been built on real estate for 100 years, right? So, and we've been kept out by redlining, by mortgage programs that have, you know, earmarked us as not, you know, worthy of getting mortgages. You know, redlining areas devalued homes and properties that have been owned by Black and brown people, so they lose equity in their homes. So there's so much to unpack. There's so much that needs to be changed, and that's why we focus on what we define as equitable development. We want everyone to be involved. We want everyone to be sensitive. We want you to come in with that lens to be able to see the changes that need to be made. Bring your resources, but bring your resources with a certain level of sensitivity to the communities that have been disenfranchised and marginalized for decades. We did a project at 20th and Ridge, Smallwood-Lewis, and I can't begin to tell you the excitement at the grand opening of that grocery store, that a community that hasn't had a grocery store in over 50 years. And for them to see a Black owner-operator be the person in their community selling goods and services, and they're being greeted every day when they come to food shop, was an amazing experience for everybody in that community. They have embraced him because this is not something that you typically see. And when we started that journey, when we were looking for a supermarket to come, the first thing we said is, we want the operator to be representative of the community in which it sits. Work with us. And they said, we're gonna try. We're gonna try. But this is not easy because that person also needed to have the capital to commit to be the owner-operator of that store. Fortunately for him, he had a village around him. He had a family that came together, pulled their resources together to help him get that store. But it takes that kind of focus and intentionality to really make the difference. So that's what we do. We wake up every day intentional about making this different. And we're not just doing it in the communities, we're doing it at the Navy Yard, right? When we put together our master plan team at the Navy Yard, we had over 50% of diversity on that team. Not just because of Mosaic, but because Ensemble, with all the conversations, they get it, right? They're respecting it, they're listening, they're hearing, they're executing on it. So, and that's in every conversation we're having at the Navy Yard. So it doesn't have to be just relegated in just the communities in which are Black and brown. We need to bring that same approach to these large institutional projects because that's where you have the most runway to make the difference. 15 years of development down at the Navy Yard. If I don't get black and brown and women-owned companies down there to benefit, shame on me. So that's what we do. That's what equitable development represents.
Can I ask you just a follow-up question, and you can, but how did you and Greg get through that first Capitol gate?
I'll tell you. It was hard. Let me tell you how it happened, honestly, seriously. We put our 401ks in, which were not that huge. Let me tell you, they weren't that large. I'm being very transparent and real right now, right? So didn't have a deal in hand. We went to the reinvestment fund and said, we want to get started in development, but we need help. They provided us with a loan/grant and said, it was $250,000. If you can develop in a neighborhood in a food desert, because it was food trust money, we will convert this to a grant and you won't have to pay that $250,000 back. 7th and Lehigh, the school that I said we decommissioned, it was a 4-lane highway. We said, this is a commercial corridor. This is a great location for a community shopping center. This is our site. We went out, we secured the tenant, we negotiated with the school district to hold the paper on it while we pulled this project together. We put $25,000 down, the school district, for a $600,000 purchase, and they held the paper for us. And we went out and we found a development partner because we knew we didn't have the balance sheet. We only recently got the balance sheet to be able to do projects on our own. This is, if you look at real estate companies, they've been passed down from generations and generations. We're now only 15 years young. That is a very young company in this space. So, reinvestment fund, PIDC, being creative, we have honed our skills with new market tax credits that could serve as equity as opposed to us having to put our own in. We had to get very creative because we didn't have the typical pathway in of friends, families, uncles, fathers who were able to provide that capital up front to be able to make an impact in this space, which has made our journey harder though.
Well,
I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted.
she doesn't look exhausted. That's good. So what I want you to do, the zoning code is 10 years old this year. And I would like you to reflect on what you've seen over the course of some time and tell us whether you think, tell us how you think it's doing. And you know, look, I was the chair of the zoning code commission. You were on the zoning code commission, so you're not off the hook either. But if there's stuff that was done wrong, tell us what you think that is.
Before you do that, I apologize. I have to leave, and I apologize that I have to, but I have a community meeting to attend for development projects.
Thank you, Leslie.
Yes.
I really appreciate
I actually think we got it right because the zoning code that we inherited to update had gotten to a point where you needed a special degree to even begin to unpack it. And our goal was that the average citizen, to some degree, could sort of understand what's going on with zoning in their community. Notwithstanding that, there are things that you can't get it right full frontal, and so we always said that the code was a living document and that it wasn't cast in cement. And as we went along and we realized we had to pivot or rejigger something, that we would, and we do, and we continue to do that. We have an internal group that is comprised of planning, law, L&I, and maybe forgetting somebody, who meet on a monthly basis based on feedback from citizens, feedback from planning examiners, feedback from planners to say, something's not quite working in the code, let's send out an omnibus to make sure it's corrected. So we think of it as a living document, and that portion is fine. Where it gets tricky is, and it's been my goal in the past 10 years, to hold the line on this. Even the staff likes to joke that Eleanor doesn't like the O word, because I don't, because overlays then will take us back to the days when the code was 700 pages. Because what overlays are is that I'm just gonna zone for what I think I want in this little part of the city. And imagine if everybody did that, then we wouldn't really have a code that works for the city. We would have a book of overlays for each piece of the neighborhood. Of course, I don't work in city council, and at the end of the day, city council is the only authority that can change the code, and they have introduced a number of overlays over the years. Staff is very keen on setting timelines on these so that they expire, but I think that would be the biggest thing. The level of creep of overlays, especially in the last year, has sort of gone up a lot. Certain council people love them. Another one is neighborhood conservation overlays, which sound great. And I leave it at that, sounds great. Really, really hard, and a burden on staff to execute, to write, and to deliver upon, because it's really just another overlay. It's a nicer overlay because the values and the goals behind it are legitimate and we can agree. But again, Alan said this earlier about something else, but the zoning code is also, people like to use it as the tool to solve a problem, and it's not the solution to every single thing that ails us in the land use department, and people think of it as such, and I think that's where some of the challenge is. We are about to update our comprehensive plan, plug here. Not sure to the degree that I or anyone else on staff has the stamina to update our zoning code, because we've continually been updating it. We feel the need, Leslie said it in terms of equitable development, that we plan for a city with new lens, especially centering equity, especially after George Floyd. Planning doesn't have a great history, as you all may know. And so we're trying to make sure that we hear from community in ways that we haven't before, to set a vision for the city that is inclusive of everyone and where they're at, and to ensure that we move forward. And that will likely have some impact on the zoning code, because as we go through that, again, like we did the last comprehensive plan, we'll make changes to the code. But I think it's been successful overall, and I'm happy that we did it. So I see some hands.
Can I just say very quickly, from the perspective of the community person on the receiving end of the zoning code, I think you got it right too.
Yeah.
And I think it was historic, and I don't think it gets enough credit. And I think that 99 to 100% of changes that have not been good changes in the zoning code since then have come out of city council and not the planning commission. At least 99% of that change.
Yeah.
Just when things are working the way you want, the way you think that they should, what is the purpose of a zoning overlay? Just to say it very simply. What's the positive purpose? Why do you?
Why do I want a zoning
When is
overlay?
it functioning right? What's a good example?
One thing I would say about it is, and I said this probably many times. Oh, sorry. Okay, here we go. And now the phone's ringing too. Stop that. Interesting. The zoning is like, if I related it to carpentry, zoning is a big circle saw. You can cut the board in half, like do that every time and do it really smartly. But if you want to do fine carpentry, zoning is a tough tool. It doesn't work very well. Now overlays, in theory, overlays are helping you refine the tool because they are place specific. But I would also say, and this comes back to what Matt was talking about earlier, place specific but to what end is really the critical question. And what are you trying to make that's good right now, and what are you trying to make that you believe is good in the future? These are tough questions because so much of it is speculative, and also, and it's a legitimate question comes up with, like, if it's planners saying it, well, how do you all know? What makes you so smart that you planners know what's coming better than anybody else? And the answer is not so simple, because the answer might be you don't know. But the answer might also be that the training that a planner or a professional gets is at least geared to think about the problem and say, all right, we're not 100% sure what's coming, but we certainly want to engage the question and put good minds to it and hopefully come out with a pretty decent answer, and a willingness to change the answer when you find out that it doesn't work. And those are really hard to do, and I think it's why people are very heavily engaged in this. I think a lot of the entry points for the debates are false entry points. And Matt, you pointed out one earlier about, as parking is a classic. I mean, honestly, there aren't that many neighborhoods in this city where parking is actually a problem. It's a problem in South Philadelphia because it's an intact, hundreds of blocks of row houses that are intact, and they're all 14 feet wide, and cars need 16, 18 feet to park. So everybody doesn't get to park in front of their house. So you start with that. And there's a whole block of them. In fact, there's hundreds of blocks of them, right? And so, yeah, that's a problem. If everybody wants to have a car, and they do, so it's a problem. But I think a lot of the stuff with the congestion, to a certain extent, the parking are red herrings. And the bigger problem that people face or don't want to face is change. Change is painful. Anybody will tell you that. And it's hard because, simply because physical things might be changing, but because it's unknown what's going to be the result of it. And this is a big issue in Philadelphia, in every neighborhood. I don't know if that answered your question, but
can I just try to add a little to that? I think there's two kinds of overlays, and I'm sure I'm oversimplifying. But there's overlays for an area where there's something about the area that it's not like most other areas of the city. And maybe I'm biased, but like the Central Delaware overlay, it's an enormous overlay area. There's no street grid east of the river. The parcels are enormous. There's never been residential historically, until the last few decades, and there's still not much and more's coming. And it cost $1 bajillion to build on the piers and off the bulkhead. So there's unique, but then there's other overlays, which are the ones that have mostly come out of council, where I have an issue with some aspect of the zoning code, and so in my district, I don't want that aspect of the zoning code to apply. And that's a totally different, and I think you could roughly stick almost every overlay in the city into one of those two buckets.
That's probably true, and the one that came up most frequently, which has to do with the use of the right tool to solve the right problem. Overlays that say, this happened in Germantown, no dollar stores.
Yes.
Or
no nail salons.
Or no nail salons or something like that. Well, you can enforce the no part of that, but you can't enforce the yes part of that. Like, what do you want? I want a Trader Joe's. Good luck, because Trader Joe's knows that everybody wants them too, at least when Trader Joe's was hotter. And they cut a mean deal, basically one that you can't afford. So, that a developer can't afford. So, it's using the right tool in the right place. And honestly, this old comment while we're on the tools subject, this old story about, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're a legislator, everything needs a law. Well, what law do you have to deal with the physical world? Zoning. So lots of stuff shows up in zoning that makes no sense and is, at a certain level, fundamentally unenforceable. We have time for one more question. I'll tell you what, it's two. I'll go here, and then we'll go back here.
Quick question related to the urban agriculture master plan. Will the zoning code take that into consideration, or will it impact or vice versa? It's an open space question. It's a land use question.
It has to. I can't speak intelligently about it because I don't know all the details, but we do have. If we're gonna open up urban agriculture, it has to be zoned accordingly because certain things are just not allowed in certain areas. So yeah, it has to sort of talk together. And I think we had representatives from Martin, right? We had people from our staff on it. Yeah.
There were. I do remember an instance. It was up in Roxborough at the very end where there was a proposal to sort of create a 1-acre farm. Some of the neighbors were going nuts, and you could sort of see that in their heads was this image of 30-foot wide combines, you know, charging down the fields, you know, flipping a wheat, and it would, which of course it never was. So that was one point. The other story that I remember, there was a competition for a development project in Francisville, and one of the proposals of the two finalists, I don't think anything got built actually, but of the two finalists, one of them wanted to do a vineyard, an urban vineyard. And and there was a lot of like, just like, oh, an urban vineyard, that's so cool. So I happened to have a good friend who actually was sort of in the wine big grape business, and my sister-in-law in New York, up in New York, who is a vintner and was a winemaker. So I called them both, and I said, urban vineyard, what do you think? And it's so funny because they both said the exact same thing without even hesitation. Never happened. Because vineyards require chemicals if you want the grapes to be wine worthy. And so you're going to spray chemicals? Whatever they do, whether they're harmless or not, you're going to spray chemicals in an urban neighborhood? Not happening. So, like, that was the end of that for me. And I said, well, what happens if you don't? They said, basically, you're in the grape juice business. But you're not in the wine business. So, anyway, there's a question back here. Go ahead. You get the last one. Make it a good one.
Well, we've heard a lot this evening about pulling on the lever of tax incentives and what we get with that, and pulling on the lever of the zoning code and what we get with that. And if we're trying to maintain or stabilize or preserve neighborhoods, and we're trying to build wealth for the people who live in those neighborhoods, are there different levers we should be pulling on in the future besides those two?
Where do we go? What do you think?
Yes.
And what are they?
I'm not sure, but I think a lot of, and I'll just harken back to the level of systemic racism that is in our society that prevents and precludes wealth building in certain neighborhoods, and poverty is a crime. Like, I just recently had my house, which is that when you assess it just, to redo your mortgage, and I refinance. No, but when they come over to check the value of your house, appraisal. So I totally decluttered my house of any sign that a person of color lived here, and I had a white friend come over so that when the appraiser showed up, that they would think that it's a white person. This is in the city of Philadelphia. I did it, and I swear I got $50,000 more in my appraisal. I can't prove it than I did. So there are fundamental things in this society that needs to be addressed, period, before we can sort of move on to the cushy things that we want to address, which, as an immigrant, I must say, America has never, not yet, addressed these issues, and they should. Life is much better when you do.
I totally agree, and you may not be able to prove it in your individual case, but there's studies that prove it over and over again, whether it's mortgage interest rates, lending decisions, they've done all kinds of studies with identical on paper, but they changed the name to signify as a very likely white name or a very likely black name, and the results are there on paper. They've been documented, unfortunately, overwhelmingly. I would say I also do not know all the levers, but it seems to me that we have a city that has a tremendous amount of vacant and underutilized land, and this is becoming a theme, but we have a land bank, and if city council had maybe meddled a little bit less, there might be more efficient disposition of the land bank for ends of promoting increased equity and social justice. And this is an argument that I maybe I'm hanging out in the wrong places online, but that I get into all the time with self-identified progressive market urbanists. But the entire real estate market in Philly, but in the world, it depends on inequalities of land value. Neighborhoods are hot, economically speaking, and valuable because other neighborhoods are not. And there's got to be something that can be done with that inequality of value to create structures that will be bulwarks or islands against the tidal wave of market forces. And I'm sorry I'm sounding vague. I don't know what the answer is, but But the idea that we have clusters of huge increases in density at the same time, and I would argue structurally, because we have other areas where you cannot develop feasibly, I feel like there's got to be opportunities in that situation somewhere that we haven't figured out yet. It's going to do it. It's got to be government action. It may not have to always be money. It may be policy. But I don't know any more than that.
Well, Matt, Eleanor, Leslie, and abstention?
You said about like diversity and social equality as like who's got the capital. I think that's incredibly important. We don't think about that enough.
It is important because it's the gateway to all of this. But I want to just thank you all for being here.
Just a quick point in closing, since the mayor's race came up a couple of times. The Carpenter's Company is part of a consortium that's being facilitated by AIA called the Build Philadelphia Alliance. We are actually working with them, GBCA, the Preservation Alliance, SAG, others, to hold a mayoral forum on exactly these kinds of issues. That's going to happen in March, so we'll make sure everyone knows about that, but it's well underway in terms of being planned now and could be a great forum to continue to lift up these kinds of issues. So thank you all for being here. Bar's open, food's back there.